Then again, retards also.
Very funny.
Let's see those notes you have for module 64. Today, I'll check 65.
Shit, I'm hungry.
Yeah. Then go buy some.
No. I'm hungry, but I'm not that hungry.
Today, I'll check 65
Thank you. We'll have some other. Explain.
Don't feel like it right now.
Just 64 today. I'll check 65 and 66 next class.
Yes, sir. Module 64 is down here.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah. Tastes like peanuts.
What? No, don't.
They kind of do. I think of it kind of like the aftertaste these have.
You know the odd thing about nuts?
What?
99% of them grow in trees, right?
They do?
Peanuts don't.
Peanuts grow on the ground, right? Yeah, I know.
Like, they were originally called the ground nuts.
I like that name.
I don't know why we started calling them peanuts.
Because the peanuts come in like little things. Like you know the expression "peas in the pod." It's also a literal term because peas comes in pods.
Exactly. But still.
I don't know why we didn't call it pea pod then. Peanut. Never mind. Oh, that makes sense. It's a compound word. Peanut.
I just need to
But
see
that question is peanut actually a nut?
Well, what's a nut first off?
Because we grab a chestnut, a coconut, almonds, they all grow in trees. But a peanut grows in the ground, like a vegetable.
Shut up for a second. Peanut. It's a pea nut. I'm serious though. It's a pea nut. No, I'm not talking about the compound word. I'm talking about pea nut. It's a pea nut. It's its own separate thing. Nobody ever said it was a nut.
Yeah, they did.
No, it's a peanut, but it's a pea. That's just a nut.
They did say that.
They did?
They did. It's a pea.
But it's not. But it's still a pea. Because it comes in the pod. Because it comes in the pod. So it's a pea. That's a nut. Boom. Problem solved. And you call me stupid. Hey, did you see your grade on that one test we had?
No.
Damn.
I won 2 though.
I won.
I'm asking when we get the test grade.
Yes, sir.
He hasn't graded.
Hey, congratulations on finishing a unit in AP Psychology. So we took our test last week. Sorry, I have not graded them yet. There's some people who still needed to finish their tests. Some people haven't taken their tests. So I was not in a huge hurry to get all of those graded. I'd like to be able to be very efficient with my time, get those all graded at the same time, and put them into the grade book at the same time. After I've done that, then I can share them with you. You can take a look at your test, decide whether you're going to do test corrections or not, decide whether you're going to do a second chance assessment or not, figure out whether the way that you studied last time or didn't study was actually an influence on your grade. So we're starting our discussion of this new unit today. And so there are several different modules, and they basically focus on different perspectives of psychology, because different perspectives of psychology are going to look at personality differently. Today, we're going to focus our attention on Sigmund Freud's theory and his understanding of personality. It's the oldest of these, and it's probably the most influential, I think, beyond psychology. Within psychology, people kind of doubt that Sigmund Freud was right about his assumptions on personality. But beyond that, when we get to English class, when we get to philosophy class, when we get to government class, those folks tend to assume that Sigmund Freud was correct in much of what he said.
Gotta go grab my water bottle in government.
I'll be right back. You got it. All right. So we need to begin with a common definition of this term, personality. We throw this term around, so most of us assume that we know what personality is, and we're probably right. But just to put some words to it, in psychology class, it's a person's characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving. So the behaviors are pretty obvious. We can see those on the outside. The person regularly is in a pattern of completing their homework and turning it in. We might say that regularly doing their homework is part of their personality. We might put a definition or an adjective to it and say that they are a responsible person. Whereas if a person rarely has their homework done, we might say, well, that's a characteristic pattern of theirs. They are irresponsible, or maybe we might go as far as to say that they're lazy. And so we get it easily when we see these observable behaviors. But also notice that it's talking about thoughts and feelings. We can't really read it by explain, Thomas. We have to make some judgments about the way that somebody thinks. We might describe them as a pessimist or an optimist. We might talk about their feelings and say that some people are worried more than others. They get nervous in crowds more than others. Those are the kinds of things that are not as easy to see, but we can certainly see how they might be characteristic patterns for some people. Because of that, we assume that every one of us has a unique personality. Because each one of us has a name. Each one of us comes from perhaps a different family. And so we get the idea that we're all different from each other. Even brothers and sisters might behave differently in class because their personalities are very different. But we do notice that many people have similar personalities. And so psychologists, just like the rest of us, might like to lump people together and talk about people as fitting into different groups because their personalities,
Really don't like
personalities are similar. So that we might be able to talk about shy people or outgoing people. We might be able to talk about jocks, goths.
Hopefully I fit in
Groups
the
of
neither of
people who
those.
have similar patterns of behavior and thoughts and behavior. In some way, Junsa, we notice that personality stays the same throughout someone's life. Remember back in the modules about development, we noticed that was kind of a theme that some psychologists focused on, was this idea of consistency throughout the lifespan. And so they pointed to evidence of that, for example, things like temperament, a measurement of somebody's emotional stability versus reactiveness, stays with us throughout our entire life because it's built into our DNA. Now, if we found a baby who is emotionally reactive, we can assume that it's going to stay consistent, and when they're an adult, they're going to be emotionally reactive. They're going to get upset very easily. But we also notice that there are ways that personality can change because of some experience. So, for example, developmental psychologists might look at learning. They might say that rewards and punishments might influence somebody's personality. They might say that observation could influence somebody's personality. They might even talk about classical conditioning. Bodies have an emotional response to some stimulus. We might have learned to have our characteristic patterns of emotions because of experiences. So our experiences might be very different from somebody else's. So that gives us a characteristic personality. Culture may influence personality. So that we notice much larger groups outside of us, even larger than our families, our entire country or our entire religion, our entire city might influence our personality. We do notice that people from certain cultures may be more or less likely to be shy versus outgoing. They may be more or less likely to be modest as opposed to kind of open with their sexuality. We might notice that different cultures may influence whether people focus on honesty more than others. And so culture may influence characteristic patterns of thoughts and feelings. And lastly, the situation may influence personality. There's a whole unit in your textbook about social psychology where the focus tends to be that people are going to be influenced by outside forces, including the situation that they're in. So, for example, school is a situation. But school is a very different situation than being at the movies with your friends. You should perhaps act differently at school than you're at the movies with your friends.
Sit quiet and listen.
Prison is a very different situation. You will probably act differently in prison than you do with your friends. Unless, of course, all of your friends end up in the same situation. Just like,
I don't think I would mind that much. However, it would be still a good life.
In for tax fraud.
Yay, Eve, happy day. And lastly, back when we were talking about psychoactive drugs, we said that drugs may influence personality. So just to pick on one, because it's on the target, alcohol has been shown to reduce people's inhibitions. Inhibition is part of people's personality. If inhibition makes it less likely that you will act on impulse, and inhibition makes it so that you will stop yourself from doing something because you think it could be embarrassing. If alcohol changes that in somebody and makes them less inhibited, then we could say that, if, at least temporarily, this drug has influenced their personality. So, find yourself a partner. You're going to have a discussion about
What's a bad idea to drink?
And this discussion is related to a free response that was on a psychology, an AP psychology exam several years ago, where students were asked to write about what might influence personality. For example, they need to talk about how somebody might learn to be less shy if they were shy. So I've underlined the word learn there. I want you to focus your attention on either observation, classical conditioning, or on rewards and punishments. Go.
Okay, give them drugs. Sorry. All right, gotta work.
Okay, there you college today.
Right. You could put them in a group of introverts. I don't know what culture has anything.
Put them with a group of their friends.
That's true.
Yeah, because that changes their personality.
Right.
Then put like random introverts in there, and they might
Extroverts, sorry.
introverts, and they might talk to them. Yes.
Put them on top of the paper, right?
Okay.
So that I can throw it away easily.
The learning one, then you can move on to the next one, which is a situation in which a shy person might become less shy.
That's what I was talking about. Drugs. Put them with their friends, change their personality, then move them
Change their personality. I don't think you're allowed to say that.
temporarily.
Temporarily.
Yes, temporarily, not permanently.
Right.
And then you can put them with and put the same people in a room of introverts, and they may become less shy for a set amount of time, but it won't last forever. As long as they're with their
As long
friends.
as they're with their friends, yeah, they
Yeah.
can be less shy, most likely.
Yes.
Assuming the person has otherwise, well, they're like extroverts. They've been there long enough, and they need to talk to somebody.
All right, goodbye.
Stop with the confetti.
Alright, back to our discussion of personality. There are a great variety of personalities exhibited, even just by the limited number of people that you know. Just look around this classroom. There are lots of different personalities. Ben's personality,
Yeah.
Tim's personality, Farah's personality, Deshaun's personality. These are all very different personalities. What you can assume is that all of these different people that you know have normal personalities, that there is nothing wrong with their personality. So even when you don't like somebody's personality, too bad. Stay away from them. There is nothing wrong with their personality. They may be generous or stingy. They may be cheerful or cranky. Their thoughts, feelings, and actions reflect their personality. In fact, they define their personality. We use these adjectives to describe not only their behaviors, we describe them. As if they are their personality. But there are some people whose personalities are so extreme, they're not considered normal. They're so different than everybody else's personality that it makes it difficult for them to make friends. It might make it difficult for them to succeed in school. It might make it difficult for them to get a job, for them to keep a job. And we would say that they have an abnormal personality. They have a personality disorder. So psychologists and psychiatrists agree that there are some people who have a mental disorder, a psychological disorder that's completely based on their personality. It's not about their mood, so it's not like depression or bipolar disorder. It's not about their thought patterns, like schizophrenia. It really is about their personality. Their characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and behavior. So there are some psychologists who would say, we need to understand what gives people these problems. How did they develop this? Is it genetic and there's nothing we can do about it? Is it something they learned? Is it something varies from situation to situation? And if so, can we fix it? Can we give them therapy? Can we give them medicine? Can we just talk to them and get them to change their thoughts or behaviors? Psychologists study not just what causes your personality, but what causes personality disorders, and therefore how to treat them. There are some psychologists who try to measure different aspects of personality so that they could be sure when it gets too extreme. When is it that a person gets too shy or too outgoing? When is it that a person gets too stingy or too generous to the point where it's a problem? We need to be able to measure it so that we know what would be considered normal before we can say what is abnormal. And there are several different perspectives of psychology that are trying to answer these different kind of questions. They're basically corresponding to the different perspectives of psychology that we've studied so far this year. So we have the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic perspective, that was Freud's perspective, and that's the one we're going to focus on today. But then there's an entire module, maybe two, about humanistic psychology, a module or two that talks about traits, and a module or two that talks about the social cognitive perspective. Today, for the rest of class, I just want to focus on Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic or psychodynamic perspective so that by the end of today, you should be able to describe personality the way that Sigmund Freud might understand it. You don't have to agree with it. In fact, many people, even psychologists, would say that Sigmund Freud was incorrect. So here we are in module 55. Find your notes for 55. Let's follow along. I have a bunch of stuff that doesn't really fit, or I'm sorry, that was not necessarily in your psychology textbook. So you probably don't have this in your notes. You'll want to fill this stuff in the blanks. This perspective on psychology is based on Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory, which suggests that there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in the unconscious part of your mind. It motivates your behaviors. It changes your thoughts and feelings. It's unconscious in the sense that we're not even aware that it's happening. We use the term unconscious and subconscious interchangeably. Don't be alarmed if on a test it uses one of those terms. Also, I use these terms, psychoanalytic and psychodynamic. I use those pretty much interchangeably. There is a subtle difference between the understanding of those vocabulary terms. Don't worry too much about it. No hair burn. Much of what you and I understand about personality comes from this guy, Sigmund Freud. Now, he's not the one who invented the term. He's not the one who invented the idea that people have a personality. Even ancient people used to talk about these characteristic patterns of thoughts and feelings and behaviors, but they didn't have a science of psychology to base this stuff. This guy, Sigmund Freud, had a whole bunch of biology from people like Charles Darwin. They had a whole bunch of philosophy from even ancient Greek philosophers. They had some science stuff. So they talked about energy. And they talked about parts of the brain and nervous system and chemicals in your body. So we're going to spend a few minutes just getting to know this guy, Sigmund Freud. I don't think they're going to ask a whole bunch of questions about Sigmund Freud on the AP Psych exam. He has kind of lost favor among psychologists these days. But for the rest of your life, when you tell people that you took Mr. Rowe's AP psychology class, they're going to say, oh, psychology, you mean like Sigmund Freud? Everyone just assumes that you're going to know about Sigmund Freud if you took psychology class. So let's get a little bit of information down about Sigmund Freud. Here's a subliminal message about him. Hopefully that gave you a certain feeling that you can't describe. So let's talk about Sigmund Freud. He's a medical doctor. He had been a very gifted young man, great student. He ends up going to the best medical schools in Europe at the time when he was, 18, 19 years old. He studied with the best medical doctors. So he ends up being a medical doctor in Vienna, not Vienna, Fairfax, Vienna, Austria, about 100 years ago. This is before even World War I, so this empire of Austria is still thriving. They're at the crossroads of trade between Asia and Europe, and so a lot of money is passing through here. He's surrounded by people who have lots and lots of money. They don't have to work hard with their hands. They're not like digging up stuff in mines. They're not making tapestries. They're just handling the paperwork as money passes through from one place to another. So he's surrounded by these people who don't have to work very hard. But this is the beginnings of what you and I would think of as a middle class. If you look around Vienna, Virginia, or even Burke, Virginia, we're surrounded by people like he was surrounded by. People who have money but don't necessarily work with their hands. They're interested in being charitable and helping poor people. They're interested in the arts, so they support concerts and paintings and sculptures. Vienna, 100 years ago, has this great reputation as a center for the arts. And here's this guy, a guy who can help them when they have medical problems. And he specializes in a very peculiar kind of medical problem, something that they used to call hysterical disorders. These were neurological disorders. So somebody might have a problem with their brain or their nervous system, but this time they couldn't find a physical cause. They couldn't find a problem with chemicals in their brain. They couldn't find a cause like nerves had been cut. They were sometimes referred to now as psychosomatic or somatoform disorders. Manifesting itself in your body, but there's no physical cause. It's a psychological cause. Some other doctors might have dismissed the patient and said, I don't see anything wrong with you. I think it's all in your head. And Sigmund Freud says, that's not dismissive. That's brilliant. If your head, if your mind is so powerful that you could make yourself sick to the point where, for example, your arm is paralyzed, it's not because of muscle damage, not because of bone damage, not because of nerve damage, but because of your own thoughts or feelings, you have made yourself paralyzed. That's pretty powerful to say that it's just in your head. And that's the kind of specific, very difficult to treat disorders that Sigmund Freud focuses on. There wasn't really a huge industry of psychiatry at this time, and yet here's this guy, a medical doctor, who says, I can apply what I know about medicine to help people with these psychological problems. So imagine this. There's a guy, and he comes into the Dr. Freud's office, and he says, Doctor, my arm is paralyzed. It's my right arm, and I'm right-handed, so I can't do it. And I've lost my job. My boss said he had to let me go. I went to lots of other doctors, and they even did an x-ray. They tried to figure out if there was something wrong with my arm. I was never injured. Nothing cut me. Nothing smashed my arm. None of that stuff. So there's no easy explanation for this. And Sigmund Freud starts talking to him. He doesn't even touch his arm. He doesn't look at it. He doesn't do another x-ray. He doesn't take any blood. He just starts talking to this guy. And these talk sessions are scheduled so that there may be once a week for an hour. This guy can come back easily because, for an hour every Wednesday and talk to Sigmund Freud. But probably because he has plenty of money. Maybe he has insurance that'll pay for this. You can imagine not everybody can do this. If somebody had damage to their arm and couldn't work, they still have to work. They have to get some other kind of job. Or if they can't, they don't have any money. They can't pay a guy like Sigmund Freud to help them by just talking. They need to get to work. There were patients who run into Dr. Freud's office and I can't speak. But there's no vocal or brain damage. There's no damage to Broca's area, no damage to Wernicke's area. But for some reason they can't talk. They've lost their ability to talk. So he starts looking for something psychological. What might it be psychological that makes it so that a person can't move their right arm and loses their job? What might it be psychological that makes it so that a person can't talk? So let's figure out where it goes. He had some unconventional treatments. Hypnosis. We all know hypnosis. He puts this person into a trance-like state, tells them something like, oh, your arm is not actually paralyzed. Let's see if you can move it. And sure enough, maybe they're able to move it. Electrotherapy for some patients. He sends massive jolts of electricity right through their brain. Even then, 100 years ago, they didn't know what it was doing to people, but now we know it was killing brain cells. It was causing brain damage. So nowadays, it's still done, but it's done with much less electricity. It's done only in extreme cases of depression, and it's done much more, humanely, for lack of a better word. The patients, for example, are given a muscle relaxant instead of being strapped down to a table. Yes.
How would that how would that cure the symptoms of depression or something like that?
So yeah, it's still kind of up in the air about how that works for depression. And many psychologists have determined that the reason it works is because it causes brain damage. So it's your brain that's giving you depression. For example, your hippocampus, which allows you to access some terrible, terrible memories of yours, and they cause damage to your brain, and now you can't come up with these bad memories anymore.
I would not recommend that.
Maybe it makes the person feel better. So that's one theory. It would be difficult to prove that because we can't really control that kind of stuff.
That sucks.
There's some disagreement about whether it sucks or not. There are some patients who were so severely depressed, they had electrotherapy, that they say, thank goodness, I don't have depression anymore. Yeah, I've lost a little bit of memories, but it's really not that big of a deal. And then other patients who say, this is awful. Yes, I was depressed, and I'm not depressed anymore, but now I'm mad because they took something from me.
Yeah.
Right? So it depends. Some patients really are glad that they've had it done. Some patients not so much. These were the early days of this. And people like Sigmund Freud were not using mild doses. They were using huge amounts of electricity through people. They caused massive brain damage, and they did have some success. This last one, though, is a vocabulary term that we should spend a little bit of time talking about. This is the one that makes Sigmund Freud famous. It's called free association. Since he's assuming that this stuff that's really causing a problem for you is stuff that's hidden in your mind, and that you cannot access it under normal circumstances, he comes up with this technique to help you to access that stuff that's hidden in your mind. Basically, he says you need to relax. You need to be comfortable. So his doctor's office doesn't look like your doctor's office and my doctor's office. It's not that white, sterile place. It looks like someone's living room. It's very comfortable. Instead of that kind of big vinyl table that you have to get on with a big piece of paper on it, he says, sit on this nice cozy couch. Put your feet up on the couch. Get comfortable, Thomas. Put this blanket over your lap so that you're cozy and warm. There's a fire in the room, in the fireplace. He wants a person to be very comfortable in this office, and they don't even have to look at Sigmund Freud. He sits kind of behind them and takes notes. Now, this has become kind of a cliche in our culture. We pick on the psychiatrist. We think that the person, the patient, is talking and talking and talking, and the psychiatrist is not even paying attention. They're doodling, they're drawing pictures, they're making a grocery shopping list. They're not even really listening. But Sigmund Freud was definitely listening. He was intense. The idea was, if we get this person to talk and talk and talk and talk, that eventually, if they get comfortable enough, they're going to reveal something that you and I might normally think of as embarrassing. They might get over this and talk about stuff that they might think is unimportant. That's the stuff that was blocking access to the hidden parts of their mind. So now, after just talking and talking and talking, they would eventually have revealed their fantasies and their fears. Those deep, dark secrets, deeply hidden in those subconscious parts of their mind, would now be revealed. And of course, it would take somebody brilliant like Sigmund Freud to be able to analyze all these transcriptions of what they have said and to be able to find these patterns that he called their fantasies and their fears. Freud noticed a pattern. He said that these patients' fantasies and fears had basically a theme. That people were either thinking a lot about sex, or they were thinking a lot about violence, or they were thinking a lot about greed. Now think about it. On the one hand, Sigmund Freud says this is perfectly natural. This is normal for you to think about sex and greed and violence because he's been influenced by people like Charles Darwin who tell us those kinds of thoughts and feelings, those kinds of impulses are built into our DNA. We have evolved from creatures like apes, not all that far from things like dogs and eventually even pigs. We've all evolved from the same kinds of stuff. So that in order for us to eat, we might have to be aggressive and fight off others. In order for our species to survive, we need to mate so that sex, a motivation toward sex, would be built into our DNA. And this idea of violence would also be there because we need to be aggressive in order to get to our food. So all this stuff that society tells us, oops, it's not on there anymore, but from 100 years ago in Vienna, in this very fancy city where money is flowing, culture, religion, art, stuff, he says that stuff is artificial. That stuff is society putting constraints on our sexual impulses, on our violent tendencies, on our natural greed. So his theory that personality is based on this stuff that is hidden in our subconscious mind, he called psychoanalysis. But here's the weird thing. The techniques that he used to try to find those hidden things, that's also called psychoanalysis. So it makes it a little tricky for us students But psychoanalysis sometimes is talking about this theory. Sometimes psychoanalysis is talking about what the psychiatrist might do. So for example, Freud believed that we're only aware of a small part of what goes on in our mind, our conscious awareness. We're aware of our day-to-day thoughts. We're aware of where we are and what's going on around us. Yeah, that stuff is in our conscious awareness, a tiny, tiny part of what is possibly going on in our mind. But most of it, maybe 80, maybe even 90% of what goes on in our mind is unconscious. We are not consciously aware. It is hidden from us. It's this unconscious part of our mind that contains those thoughts, wishes, memories, and feelings that society has told us you really shouldn't be having those thoughts. You shouldn't be thinking about violence. Now, we're naturally going to be thinking about violence, so what do we do with it? We just hide it from ourselves. Society says you shouldn't be thinking about sex. Well, our body says you should be thinking about sex. So what do we do with it? We hide it. We shove it into this part of our mind called the unconscious part of our mind. Now, some of that stuff you can access pretty easily. So for example, you're not currently thinking about this, but I could easily get you to access it simply by asking. You start to analyze what is in your mind, and you could quickly come up with a memory. Do you remember the name of your 4th grade teacher? Pretty easily, right? There's no terrible taboo associated with that. Not all of us, but if we try, we could come up with it. So that's called the pre-conscious area. It's there. It's available. You just have to try, and you could. I could give an easier one. You're not currently thinking about it, but what is 3 plus 6? See, you're able to do that kind of stuff pretty easily because it's there. All right. So Sigmund Freud says an iceberg is a pretty good analogy for your mind. So imagine yourself in a ship. Here's the water level about right here. And so it makes a difference between the part of the iceberg that sticks up out of the water and most of the iceberg that is underneath. Don't worry about specific things that are there, but just in general, the part of an iceberg that we're aware of if we're in a ship, we know that that's not all of the iceberg, that there's a ton of the iceberg that's underneath. We also see the iceberg as very beautiful and peaceful. It just looks like a fluffy piece of white ice there. But even 100 years ago, when Sigmund Freud was doing his work, he knew about stuff like the Titanic. He knew that if you think that this iceberg is just peaceful and beautiful, pure and white, that you're in for a terrible, terrible surprise if you just try to brush it aside, like the Titanic. It's this nasty stuff underneath which could rip a hole in your hull and bring you down. That's the dangerous part of the iceberg. And Sigmund Freud says, this is the dangerous part of your personality as well. The part that's up here, you're able to say, I'm a good person, I'm generous. I donate to charity. When I get upset, I count to 10 and I don't punch people in the face. I'm a very peaceful person. But he says, you've got some really nasty stuff hidden in your unconscious or subconscious mind, and that's the stuff that he's worried about. That's the stuff that might cause those mysterious symptoms. So these are unacceptable passions, thoughts that were repressed, forcibly blocked from our consciousness. Your tendency to be angry enough to want to punch somebody in the face gets hidden. Not just hidden from the target. If you want to punch your boss in the face, you don't just say, well, hey, boss, good to see you. I don't want to punch you in the face at all. You don't only hide it from them, you hide it from yourself. It's blocked from your consciousness. You don't even know that you want to punch your boss in the face. These unacknowledged impulses, though, will sneak into your thoughts and actions in disguised form. You might have a slip of the tongue where you accidentally say something violent to your boss. Or you might have some mysterious symptom. Like our guy who went to see Dr. Freud and couldn't move his arm. This guy couldn't move his arm, and maybe Sigmund Freud says, I think the reason you can't move your arm is because you are so angry at your boss, and you have this violent tendency. You want to punch your boss in the face, but you know society tells you, if you punch your boss in the face, you're going to get fired. You might even get arrested if you punch your boss in the face. So society is telling this guy, no, don't act on your impulse. Yes, this guy's a jerk, but do not punch him in the face. But wait a minute, you lost your job because you couldn't move your arm. Well, good. You don't have to hang out with this guy that you hate anymore. Plus, isn't it better to lose your job because you can't move your arm than it is to lose your job because you punch your boss in the face? Your wife and kids will say, poor dad, he lost his job because his arm is paralyzed. He can't figure out what's wrong with him. Whereas if they had to say, dad, what a jerk, couldn't control his temperature, lost his job because he punched his boss in the face, now we're all poor, now dad's in jail. That's not the same, is it? Society, then, these external pressures have made it so that, of course, you don't punch your boss in the face, but you might develop some weird symptoms to try to compensate for it. So Sigmund Freud says our entire personality is made up of what we do with this struggle between that biological impulse, like wanting to punch somebody in the face, and society's restraint saying you're going to go to jail and you're going to lose your job and your wife and kids are going to be really mad at you. Those social constraints on us that keep us from doing all those biological things that any animal could do. Apes don't lose their job because they beat each other up. Ape mates don't say, we're not going to hang out anymore because you're a violent being and this is really not exciting. So here he is working soon after Charles Darwin. Evolution tells him that these violent tendencies are built into our DNA. Apes have to fight each other in order to establish territory, and if they win the fight, they get the territory. They get to mate. Their genes are passed on. Apes have to eat. They have to eat a lot. And they're motivated to even steal food from us. There's no stigma against being greedy in evolution. In evolutionary terms, greed is awesome. Greed is desirable. Greed helps you survive. Giving away food? You're going to die. And sex. Sex is built into our DNA because that's how evolution works. So Freud assumes that humans, just like all these other animals, like apes and pigs and dogs, we are sexual and aggressive beasts. We are greedy, not naturally charitable. We are sexual, not willing to wait until marriage. We are aggressive. We would beat each other up. At least that's what's built into us at a very basic level. It's society that puts constraints on all of this stuff. So let's go back to another version of that iceberg. This time we notice three different parts here: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is all of that biological stuff that we got according to Charles Darwin. This is the stuff that makes us sexual and aggressive and greedy beasts. This superego is the stuff that we get from police, from priests and clerics, from our own mom, from our wife and kids. All that stuff that says society is telling you, don't do this. Society says, don't punch your boss in the face. Society says, don't eat all of the food yourself. Share with others. Society says, don't have sex until marriage. There's a conflict between those two things. That's where this thing sprouts up. This thing develops, this ego, to try to negotiate between these two things. So it's a little confusing to psychology students because we've all heard this term ego before. We thought ego was a bad thing. Shame on you. You have such a big ego. You think you're better than everybody else. You think you're smarter than everybody else. That's your ego. But that's not what psychologists call ego. Ego roughly translates to basically who you think you are, your personality. So here we are talking about personality, and we're told the part of your personality that you think you are is only a small chunk of it. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that you don't even realize is influencing your behaviors and your thoughts and your feelings. It has come from your culture, perhaps your religion, or teachers, or the cops. And there's a whole bunch of that stuff that's influencing you that you don't even realize is there. And a big chunk of it is stuff that's built into your DNA and makes you feel very uncomfortable. It makes you feel guilty and anxious. All right. So when we get back from lunch, we'll talk about how this stuff develops. Enjoy your lunch.
Sorry. I got a phone. Fucking delicious.